Todos vamos dar início a este Seminário CLUL, so I'm going to switch to English and say, Maria Polinsky, that it's a real pleasure that you're here with us, that you came to Portugal, you came to Braga, and all of a sudden, through this initial contact by Marcel, you also accepted to give a talk in Lisbon, so it's really a great pleasure to have you here with us. I'm going to pass the word and give the floor to Marcel, who's going to say a few more things before you start.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
For being here with us.
Okay. Without todos, I'm going to speak English as well. You hadn't expected anything else from me, I guess. Since Masha has already been welcomed, I don't have to do it again, but still I'm very pleased to be able to say a few words to introduce Masha to you all, although I'm sure all these words will be redundant because I don't think there's anyone in the world of linguistics who hasn't come across Maria Polinsky in one way or another. Masha is really one of the most knowledgeable and versatile linguists in the field, with a long-standing track record in theoretical, fieldwork and experimental linguistics, and a citation index that very few of her colleagues would even come close to. The range of languages that Masha has worked on is almost mind-boggling, from her native Russian and its heritage varieties, via the languages of the Caucasus, to Austronesian and Mayan, so she basically has covered the globe. And she also has physically traveled the globe, and you never know from one day to the next where Masha might be when you're emailing her. She's always in an unexpected place. Among her favorite research topics are ergativity and verb initial order, but these are just among her favorite topics. In theoretical linguistics, probably her best known contribution is the paper that she did with Eric Potsdam on long-distance agreement in CES, a paper that quickly sparked a cottage industry of studies on long-distance agreement and the role of information structure in connection with that. It's really one of my all-time favorites, and I'm very proud that that paper came out in NLLT, Natural Language and Linguistic Theory, the journal that Masha joined at some point as associate editor, where she served for several years while I was editor-in-chief. And working side by side with Masha on editorial as well as analytical work has always been a hugely enriching experience for me. Most recently, and still ongoing, in connection with a joint article on strange hybrids of unaccusativity and transitivity in Dutch, whose lead author is Irina Burukina, who was my graduate student and one of the members of Masha's Guatemala field station for Mayan languages. Masha has innumerably many publications in all sorts of different sub-branches in linguistics. It would be impossible for me to even give you a summary of them. Let me just, by way of general introduction, show you this book, which arrived on my desk just today. It arrived at the university yesterday. This is a free copy of the Cambridge Handbook of Comparative Syntax, which Chef Barbiers, Norbert Korver, and Maria Polinsky are the editors of, and this is obviously the gold standard for work on comparative syntax. If you are interested in comparative syntax, which of course you are, then this is your reference. Earlier this year, Masha was honored with a Festschrift testifying to her impact on the field. It really is a who's who in linguistics, with some 30 contributions covering a great variety of linguistic subdisciplines. It's an open access volume, highly recommended. Its main title is Syntax in Uncharted Territories, very fitting in many ways. Today, Masha will venture out into the relatively uncharted and highly complex territory of multiple and sometimes competing grammatical representations for what appears to be a single phenomenon, looking at the problem through both monolingual and bilingual lenses. And her talk is entitled, as you can also see, the title has changed. The talk is entitled Grammatical Competition, Multiple Grammars as a Theoretical Concept and Facts on the Ground. Masha.
Thank you very much both to Dirk and to Marcel. I feel like this was talking about somebody else, so I don't know if I can live up to the expectations. It's an honor to be here. It's also my first time in Portugal, and it's just amazing to see all the linguistic richness. I'm not talking about cultural and touristic richness because you're used to that, but linguistically there is so much happening here, and so it's a big honor. And I very much hope that what I'm going to present today will give you some thoughts in terms of future projects, because for me this is a new project as well. It started about a year ago. There are many unanswered questions, and hopefully together we can solve some of them. And in fact, one of the case studies I'm going to present for you is one that ends with an open question. So let me start with the problem at a glance. And the problem sums up in the following way. In some context, you can have more than one grammatical structure operation for a surface string, which looks the same. So a surface string may be structurally ambiguous, and therefore amenable to more than one analysis. And this is especially true in the absence of clear evidence, where the evidence tells you favor this structure over this structure. So you see a string, and your job as a learner, as a linguist, is to figure out what the analysis is. So this is what we're going to call multiple grammars, where an individual speaker controls two or more grammatical structures or two or more operations for a particular surface string. So this is the notion, yes, this is a notion which was introduced a long time ago by Tony Kroc, whose work I will refer to. And in the next slide, unfortunately, some of the fonts didn't transfer. So where you see a 5, it has to go this way. Okay? So what you have is you have a sentence, she called her uncle from Portugal. And this could mean two different things. One is the phone call was made from Portugal. We don't care where the uncle is. The other is that the uncle lives in Portugal. And I believe it's the same in Portuguese, so it doesn't really matter. So we have this ambiguity, which on the screen is represented by bracketed structure. So in one case, you know, the uncle from Portugal form a single noun phrase. And in the other case, you have the uncle from Portugal and a prepositional phrase. So this is a very clear case of ambiguity, something we teach our students in various syntax classes. And so this is just a simple illustration of multiple grammars where two or more grammatical structures can be applied to the same surface string. She called her uncle from Portugal. Despite the name, when we say multiple grammar, we do not define that in respect to the entire grammar controlled by a speaker, but more in respect to specific constructions or strings which are compatible with multiple grammatical analysis. And that takes me back to my title, where multiple grammar essentially means grammatical competition. So I've given this a version of this talk in a couple of places, and I've received quite a bit of pushback about the term multiple grammar. I have to say, we owe it to the memory of Tony Kroc, who was an amazing linguist, to use the term. And yes, many terms are not very good, but you know, as long as we agree what this means, I think we can all live with that. So this is an instance of grammatical competition. So the premise that we're going to live with is that if you have multiple grammars in the input, the language learner, the child acquiring a language, has to deal with indeterminacy in the input. They have to figure out how to analyze the indeterminate input. And the more specific question I want to look at is how monolingual and bilingual learners deal with this indeterminacy or underdeterminacy in the input. So the plan for today is I will talk about this general indeterminacy which owes its source to multiple grammars. Then I will present the more abstract typology of multiple grammars in a monolingual context. Then I will present two case studies in bilingual context, and one of them, as I already said, will end up with an open question, and maybe you guys can answer my question. And then we'll have conclusions and outstanding questions, and I will be very grateful for all kinds of feedback. Before I go on, let me just check if I'm going too fast, too slow, if everyone can follow me, and if people in the back can hear me okay? All right. Okay, so let's start with the big picture. As I already said, empirically, a number of linguistic phenomena may manifest variation or optionality. And the example we're going to use is from Marcel's work, from British English. In the previous version of this talk, I actually had Marcel's picture. But because he's here, I don't need to do that. So we're just going to have the British flag. So in British English, you have words like committee, gang, band, team, which can have either singular or plural agreement. So you can have the committee are meeting right now, or the committee is meeting right now. So we have this optionality or variation. So the question is how this happens. You see that it's not all random. So there is a particular correlation with the choice of the relative pronoun. So if you use the pronoun which, the agreement is going to be singular. So you say the committee which has decided, but not who has decided. With who, there is a strong preference for have, and which is very unlikely. There's also the issue of scope. If you say an academic committee is likely to prioritize process over progress, you have ambiguous scope. But if you have an academic committee are likely to prioritize process over progress, this can only take one surface scope. And we don't have plural agreement in existential construction, so you cannot say there are a committee holding a meeting in this room. You have to say there is a committee holding a meeting in this room. So the question is, can we somehow unify all these correlated properties under two different analyses? And going back to Marcel's work and some work which followed, there are essentially two underlying structures behind words like committee, band, gang, and team. One is the regular noun phrase, which is not specified for plural. And the other is a complex noun phrase headed by a null plural pronoun. So that pronoun is specified for plural. That's how you get the plural agreement. And because you have the pronoun in one representation, not in the other, you're going to get some correlated properties, which follow from the presence or absence of the pronouns. So each structure comes with a number of correlated properties. So if you have the choice of the relative pronoun, again, which goes with the noun phrase that doesn't have specification for the plural, who goes for the pronoun. No plural agreement in existentials. You say there is a committee holding a meeting in this room. Just because pronouns are not good associates with there, just like we cannot say there are a committee holding a meeting, we don't say there are they or them in funny hats. Same kind of correlation. So the point of this, and I'm simplifying things quite a bit, this is not random. So we have a bunch of correlated properties. So the choice of singular versus plural is not random, and what we can call optionality is only apparent. So what do we learn from this example? We see that speakers can associate different grammatical analysis with the same surface string. And if there are different grammatical analyses, that means there may be grammatical competition, either for one and the same speaker or across speakers, across a community of speakers. And the most important point from the short kind of survey of the committee examples for me is that individual grammatical analysis, the two analyses presented here, are correlated with other properties of the language. And that's where the learner might get their input in order to determine one analysis over the other. So assuming that there is this kind of competition, there is a number of linguistic phenomena that manifest optionality and variation. We want to ask how these options can be distributed across speakers. So we're going to start with a simple illustration. I'm going to go back to the example of she called her uncle from Portugal, and I'm going to present the possible scenarios, and then we're going to talk about them in more detail. So she called her uncle from Portugal. We have two interpretations. The uncle is in Portugal, or the phone call came from Portugal. And imagine that all your speakers in a community share both analyses. Everybody agrees that these two interpretations are possible, so that's what we will call shared multiple grammars. Okay? It's possible that some speakers will have only one structure, So some speakers in the community will interpret that as meaning that the uncle lives in Portugal, and others will interpret that as the phone call coming from Portugal. That's what we'll call competing multiple grammars. And again, that's in a community, not in a particular speaker. And then finally, we might have a situation which I will call partial multiple grammars, where a subset of speakers will allow the ambiguity and the subset of speakers will only allow one analysis. For my purposes right now, it doesn't matter which one. So this will be what I would call partial multiple grammars. So now with those three scenarios identified, let's look at what I would call a unicorn scenario. You see a unicorn in this picture, and the reason for the unicorn is that it's hard to imagine an idealized homogeneous community where everybody has a similar background, similar educational experience, and everyone is monolingual. But that's exactly how a lot of work in generative grammar started. If you go back to Chomsky's writings in the 1960s, he talks about, your ideal speaker, and that's the unicorn. So imagining the unicorn, we have three possibilities. We can have shared multiple grammars, where with respect to a particular phenomenon, speakers share multiple options distributed in a principled manner. So I've given two examples. One is what I would call a junction height, the uncle from Portugal. The other is a committee in British English. We actually don't know if all British speakers have this plural versus singular agreement. So I put in the parentheses by assumption. That's an empirical question, but these are possible examples. Well, now we're going to look at some examples of partial multiple grammar with respect to phenomenon X. A subset of speakers have multiple options and others entertain just one option. And this will be English scope ambiguity. So we're going to look at Ben Bruning's examples. He uses those examples for his scope project, Playmobil. So you have a picture like this, and the speaker, you hear a sentence, a shark attacked every pirate. And your job is to decide whether or not this picture matches what you said. So I think everybody will agree that this is okay, right? Now, if we have this picture, and we also say a shark attacked every pirate, some English speakers will agree and some won't. So the picture on the left shows what we call surface scope. A shark, there's a single shark attacking every pirate. Every English speaker will accept that. On the other side, you have a picture where there's a shark for each unfortunate pirate, and that's inverse scope. And what we see when we test that empirically is that only a subset of English speakers accept that. So this is from a bunch of studies, not just the study that my colleagues and I did, but if you test English speakers group after group, you see that only about half of English speakers accept inverse scope. That means that for every English speaker, you're going to have the surface scope representation, a shark attacked every pirate, the picture on the left. But only half of English speakers will accept the picture on the right. And that's something that, whenever I teach syntax, I present something like that. And half of my students sit there and look at me like I have three heads. But this is a genuine representation of what we see in the population. So this is partial multiple grammars. And then finally, competing multiple grammars, the most kind of striking case where with respect to phenomenon X, speaker group A has option X and speaker group B has option Y. So this would be observed by bimodal distribution. And I'm going to present some examples and then talk about the others. So the one I'm going to present in a moment is adjunct islands in Norwegian and Japanese. But there are some other examples, for example, Korean verb raising, where Korean speakers fall into two groups. And you can test that, again, using correlated properties. Predicate agreement in Tutuhil. Marcel kindly mentioned the work on Mayan. Mostly it's work by my students, so I'm always there sort of just as an adult. But my students, Paulina Lescao and Rodrigo Ranero, worked on the Mayan language Tutuhil, and they looked at a case where there were three sisters living in the same house under the same roof, speaking to each other, and each sister had a different grammar of agreement, number agreement. And then just recently, I was at the conference in Paris where there was a presentation on Georgian proverbs, something like do so. And again, you see that Georgian speakers fall into two groups with respect to agreement in such verbs. So let's look at adjunct clause islands. For those of most of you, it's something that you remember, but just in case people forgot what it is. We start with the sentence, Mom will be upset if you don't include Kim in the party. In English, a question like, who will Mom be upset if you don't include in the party is completely impossible. So that's a violation that we call adjunct island violation. But English is different from some other languages. So if you look at Japanese or Norwegian, so the chart here is for Japanese, you see that speakers fall into two groups. Some speakers are completely fine with who will you be upset if Mom doesn't include in the party, and some speakers reject that. So we get a bimodal distribution, and that's a sign that we're looking at competing multiple grammars. So just to sort of reiterate, we have some examples. Again, the example of the British committee is by assumption. It would be interesting to see what actually happens. And some other examples I've shown you have been tested on various populations of speakers. What's important is that all these unicorn scenarios are accompanied by indeterminacy or underdeterminacy in the input. So the learner doesn't know what to do. The Japanese learner who looks at these islands has to figure out if in their grammar it's going to be okay or not okay. So the core points are that each structure is deterministic, but they can also compete and be contradictory. And an individual speaker can control just one grammatical analysis or more than one. If a speaker has more than one analysis, they can still favor one. But that doesn't really cancel the fact that the two analyses still coexist for one and the same speaker. If you look back at the surface and inverse scope, those 56% of English speakers who accept both will always give you the surface scope first. And if we look at the reaction times, yes, they favor that, but they don't reject the other. So the favoritism doesn't really matter. So I want to also add a disclaimer, something that I will come back to, which is like a big portion of this project. Not everything that we see in language, not all kinds of optionality, is due to multiple grammars. And it's our goal to figure out what cases of multiple grammars actually exist and separate them from genuine optionality or variation. And we're still learning how to do that. This is the big question that I will come back to at the end of this talk, and this is where I would very much welcome suggestions. Okay? But so when the language input provides underdetermined or indeterminate evidence, what can we expect of language learners? What do we hope that they can do? So this is the next question now that we've had those unicorn scenarios. So another way of asking this question is, how is the grammar of generation X, the input, matched in the grammar of generation X plus 1, which is intake? Okay? So there are three logical possibilities. You will probably look at one of them and tell me right away that it's impossible, but they are logically possible. So one is that input completely matches the intake. So there will be complete and full match between generations, full convergence. Very unlikely. Languages change, and it's partly sociological. You know, children never want to sound like their parents, so there is a strong motivation behind that. But this is a logical possibility. Another possibility which we often see and which gets reflected in language change is partial match, where input and intake only partially overlap, and that leads to language diachrony. And then finally, there could be complete divergence. And that's sometimes what happens in languages like Pidgins and Creoles, but that's another possibility. So these are the three logical possibilities. And if we look at those logical possibilities, we can also ask ourselves which factors influence matching. And there are three answers to this question. One is that the matching of the input to intake is very much influenced by metalinguistic capacities and processing systems. So that's the answer that my colleague Jeff Lids and his teachers Lila Gleitman and Harry Gleitman have given. The idea is that, you know, a child comes with a smaller metalinguistic capacity that leads to change, and as a result the intake doesn't match the input. Another answer which has been very much pursued by Eva Dubrovska and her colleagues is that a lot depends on educational level and socioeconomic status. She had that famous study where she took a lot of examples from linguistic inquiry, which are famous for being very complex, gave them to people who are janitors in the university and then graduate students and professors, and as a result, she got a very varied distribution. And there's no denying the education and socioeconomic status. I'm not going to argue against it, but the thing is, if you look at the study on adjunct islands, the one I cited earlier, the speakers were all matched by education and SES, and you still got the bimodal distribution. So it's not all the answer. So what I would like to propose in this talk is that we also have to look at abstract strategies of input structuring. So abstract rules of grammar which influence how the matching or not matching of input and intake will happen. So this is my typology, and now I would like to look at 2 case studies in bilingual context. So I'm going to complicate things even more. I've already complicated them quite a bit, but now we're going to look at even worse situation. So we're going to look at grammar alignments, and I'm going to distinguish between societal language, SL, and home language, or sometimes it's called heritage language. I've done a lot of work on heritage languages, but I've also gotten a lot of flack for using the term heritage language, so use whatever term you like. But basically, there is no such thing as a balanced bilingual. It's almost like an ideal husband. They don't exist. So there is always a stronger language. And so the stronger language is going to be, for these people, is going to be the societal language, and then there will be the home language. So, and the home language is something that these people get at home because, I study most of my bilingual speakers in the United States, which is known as the language graveyard, because everybody is supposed to speak English. And so as a result, the home language is always on the weaker side. So imagine that your societal language has a single grammar for a particular phenomenon, and so does your home language. We don't know what's going to happen in the bilingual language, so that's why the question marks. Both languages in the input may have multiple grammars. Again, we don't know what's going to happen. One language can have single grammar, the other language may have multiple grammar with respect to a particular phenomenon. And again, you end up with a million question marks on the I have problems with right and left, right-hand side of the chart. So this is where the questions come. Okay? So I wish I could present several studies because I have case studies for each of these, but my goal is to present just a couple of representative cases and talk about how we can look for multiple grammars all over. So the first one I want to present, it has to do with acceptive constructions. So acceptive constructions denote something that is left out of a larger set, an exclusion to a generalization. So there's a famous quote from Franklin Roosevelt: "We have nothing to fear except fear itself," or "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." Okay? So if we look at the kind of meaning of this construction, the idea is that if you remove fear from the domain of quantification, then there is nothing left to be afraid of. That's kind of the idea. So the generalization is there is nothing to be afraid of once the fear is not in the picture. So the anatomy of the acceptive construction is fairly robust across different languages. So you have the domain of quantification. In the Roosevelt quote is the word nothing. So we call it domain of quantification, or also associate. And then we have the acceptive phrase, which in this case will be except fear itself, but fear itself, or save for fear itself. In English, there are many of them. So in Portuguese, I think it's exceto, and sabe, well, aparte. Okay, so there may be several markers. So I hope that you will start thinking about that, because whenever I talk about acceptives, everybody says, well, it's not really part of the grammar, but yeah, we need to study them. And there are a lot of interesting things. So within the acceptive phrase, there is the acceptive marker, and then there is the exception. So again, associate, acceptive marker, and exception. Okay? In English, we're going to look at accept. English accept can be disconnected from the associate. You can say everyone except Sandy cried, but also everyone cried except Sandy. You take except Sandy, move it away. And we can also show for English that the exception is clausal. So everyone cried except Sandy did not cry. And then you delete part of that clause, but you don't have to. And languages vary in terms of how the acceptives are clausal or not clausal. I don't know how European Portuguese works, but I had someone in my project work on Brazilian Portuguese, and she showed that you cannot really repeat the whole acceptive clause. So that seems to be an interesting kind of fact. It's common for acceptive constructions to function as negative polarity items licensed in what's called downward entailing context. So we see that in Japanese, and I'm particularly pleased to cite French here because the work comes from Marcel's student, Teresa O'Neill, where you have ne que. And so basically, in languages like Japanese, where you have shikanai, or in French with ne que, you have several contexts that license acceptance. It can be negation. It can also be lexical negation, such verbs as forbid, not allow. It can be conditionals, which is also a downward entailing context, and it could be some questions. So the idea is that you basically have the contrast between downward entailment and upward entailment, and only downward entailing context license NPIs, negative polarity items. So when we call them NPIs, it's a little bit of a kind of a stretch because they're just licensed in a number of contexts. Okay. So we're going to look at the cross between English and Russian. So Russian has two acceptive markers. One is a preposition, kromě, which assigns genitive to a noun phrase and forms well-behaved phrasal acceptive. So it always has to be a noun phrase. It has to have genitive because that's what this preposition wants. And then the other one is a subordinating conjunction, which is compatible with the whole clause. And it forms clear clausal acceptive, just like in English, everyone cried except Sandy did not cry. But there is also a little quirk, so I'm going to show you in a moment. So these are the starting point examples. These events are nothing except her own imagination. The sentences mean the same thing. In the first one with the red except, you have a long noun phrase which is assigned genitive. In the second one, you have the conjunction, кроме как, except as, and then you can see that her own imagination appears in the instrumental case, which matches the case of the associate in the antecedent. Okay? So if we look at the conjunction, кроме как, we can clearly see that in Russian these acceptives require downward entailment. So they are NPIs. So these are data from the Russian National Corpus. So if you look at the distribution of these acceptives, a very large percentage comes from negation. That's the whole blue pie. The pink is questions. There's a little bit of conditionals, and then there's a small sliver, I think 16 sentences, which are non-negative, non-conditional. And I ran them by some Russian speakers, and they didn't even all agree, so these are clearly some kind of error. So this is a very clear picture that these are downward entailing NPI, downward entailing context for NPI. So we're going to now look at English dominant Russian bilinguals, otherwise known as heritage speakers. We're going to test them on both except, which takes the genitive, and on the conjunction, except. I'm not going to show you the first one here, but so basically what we did was we compared first generation immigrants, which is the input of these speakers, their parents, so to say, and heritage speakers. They all share English as the dominant societal language. All the speakers we tested have both Russian parents, so they were exposed to Russian at home. Their societal language is English. We tested them both in English and in Russian, and the examples were in Russian downward entailing and non-downward entailing, something like I did not go anywhere except to the grocery store. That's the one that would be illicit with the conjunction. And the other one is I went everywhere except to the grocery store, fine in English, bad in Russian. So let's see what our speakers do. These are ratings by Likert scale. So 1 to 7, they just have to look at the sentence and say, I like it, I don't like it at the scale of 1 to 7. 1 is bad, 7 is great. And we transform them into z-scores. The black bars are native speakers, and the gray bars are heritage speakers. So if you look at the downward entailing context, you can see that the native speakers and the heritage speakers are doing the same thing. But if we now look at the absence of downward entailment, you can see that the heritage speakers are doing something completely different from the input. So the native speakers don't really like those, which is exactly like what we saw in this chart. So the native speakers are basically showing what the corpus did. No surprises here, but the heritage speakers are clearly liking it. And if we now break them down, there were 35 speakers. Sorry, I didn't put it on the chart. we see that there is a very clear bimodal distribution. So there are people who accept the non-downward, the absence of downward entailment. In other words, for them, this conjunction acceptive is not an NPI anymore. And there are speakers who are just like the input. So we've got the same bimodal distribution that we saw with the Japanese adjunct ions. Okay. So we end up with two groups. The first one matches the baseline, where the conjunction is only available in downward entailing context. The other one is the group that treats this conjunction as a non-NPI licensed, so that it's allowed in all kinds of contexts. So we end up with a more complex grammar than in the input. So in English, we have a single grammar because English acceptives do not require downward entailment. In Russian, we have a single grammar with downward entailment. In Heritage Russian, we have competing multiple grammars. We have two different populations. So the question is whether or not these two separate groups that we have in Russian correlate with independent properties. And the hypothesis is that the non-downward entailing group, the group which differs from the input, is subject to cross-linguistic influence. Because in English, they don't have that. They should be doing what English does, and they're transferring it to their Russian. If that's the case, we can reasonably expect that the people who are weaker in their home language will belong to that group. They will lose downward entailment. People who are stronger speakers will not lose it. So there are many ways to measure proficiency, and the way we measured it is by speech rate, because lexical access often tells you how proficient speakers are. So what you have here is the blue line is the ratings, the red line is the speech rate, and what you see, just because the lines completely vary or zigzag over each other, there's no correlation between the proficiency and the belonging to one or the other group. So it looks like the influence from English is not the culprit. Okay? So this is where my question to the audience is: we don't have any clear evidence of cross-linguistic influence, but we do see this bimodal distribution. And so the question is, what motivates the emergence of this multiple grammar in the heritage language of these speakers? So this is where I'm kind of trying to do what I preached in the beginning, but failing to do so, and that is I haven't found a correlated property yet. It may well be that, we need some other measures, not just speech rate, and maybe there will be some measures of proficiency, but at least on the first try, we don't see correlation yet. So this is something that I wanted to show as the first study, and what we see is that multiple grammars can develop in a home language, making it more complex than the baseline. And so the question that I can't answer yet is whether or not the distribution of multiple grammars of acceptives can be predicted on the basis of age of acquisition or some other factors. So the other study I wanted to show you comes from a very interesting language pair, Chinese and Tibetan. And it goes back to the work by Yuan-Han Chen at Duke University. So I'm going to very quickly talk about universal quantifiers and negation. Then we're going to talk about Mandarin monolinguals, Tibetan monolinguals, and then Mandarin-Tibetan bilinguals. So we know a lot of these sentences from child language studies where you have a universal quantifier in the subject position interacting with negation. So every horse did not jump over the fence. That could mean that no horse jumped over the fence or some horses jumped over the fence. I don't know how Portuguese works. I'd be curious. But so in English, at least some speakers have this ambiguity. So the moving parts are that we have a universally quantified expression in the subject position. It can be expressed by every, all, by a quantifier with a distributive flavor. In Mandarin, it's do. In German, it's something that starts with yed. Could be, and distributive quantified phrases often take wide scope no matter what. And the other piece that people often evoke when they talk about the interaction between quantifier and negation is that negation undergoes what's called LF raising. So you don't really see it, but negation goes up, and because it goes up in the representation of the clause, it takes scope over the quantified expression. That's how you get two readings. no horses jumped over the fence, or some horses jumped over the fence. So this is the paper that I very much like and recommend very highly by Yung-Chun Chen and Ting-Ting Huan. So they look at the scope assignment of QNEG sentences in Chinese speakers, and then the other one is in Tibetan. So there are two papers. So if we start with Mandarin, with Chinese, what we see is that in Mandarin, Mandarin is well known for having frozen scope. So if you have something like all teachers did not use Sandy's car, that can only mean for every teacher that teacher did not use Sandy's car. It does not mean that it's not the case that all teachers use Sandy's car. So you don't get the inverse scope like you had in English. Okay? The question is why? And that's an interesting question, and probably one of the most promising answers is that what we call subject in Mandarin is actually topic. That's something that Rich Larson and his students have proposed in their recent work. And topics generally take wide scope. So because it's a topic, you're not going to get inverse scope. Okay? And I would love you to hold this thought because we'll come back to that. To quote them, they say, you know, Mandarin contains a special structural position, namely topic phrase projection, which is absent in English. The additional subject position is what has led a range of researchers to classify Mandarin as a topic prominent language, and they go back to the grammar by Lee and Thompson and several other researchers, showing that indeed what we think of as a subject in Mandarin is much more privileged information structurally than the subject in English. Okay? So neg raising, which I mentioned earlier, may still happen in Mandarin. But if it happens, the negation is still going to be below what we call subject. So you see that in these two bullets on the slide, where the first one shows negation in the base position. The second one shows negation raising at the left. But it's still below the subject, so you're not going to get inverse scope. Okay? So these are the Mandarin facts. The question that might be interesting is also whether or not Mandarin topics are base generated or they move from the specifier of the inflectional phrase. This is an unresolved question, and we also know from some independent work is that merge is very easy for heritage speakers. What they really have trouble with is moving things. So move as an operation is very problematic for heritage speakers. So we can also see that there might be some difference here. Okay? So if we now look at Tibetan, Tibetan is like English. In Tibetan, you can have both inverse and surface scope, just like, you know, with the English sentence, not every horse jumped over the fence, or every horse did not jump over the fence. In this sentence, all teachers did not use Sandy's car. You can have surface scope, where all scopes over not. For every teacher, he or she did not use Sandy's car. Or it's not the case that all teachers use Sandy's car. Only some teachers use Sandy's car. So it's exactly like in English. Okay? So what they did was they tested Mandarin dominant Tibetan heritage speakers. So these are people living in China. They still speak Tibetan, but they're all dominant in English. You can probably tell me that the number of participants is fairly small, but this is a good start. And we see that there are three groups of speakers. So the first group is the one that basically acts as if Mandarin and Tibetan is like English. You have inverse scope in both. So not every teacher did not use Sandy's car can mean two things. The second group, the group of 11 people, accepts inverse scope in Tibetan, as they should, and rejects it in Chinese, as they should. And the third group rejects inverse scope everywhere. Okay? So we have a very nice trimodal distribution. And what you can see is that the groups are comparable. So you see that it's about 30% for each case. Okay? So we can say that the first group shows what we can call bidirectional transfer. The second group is faithful to both baselines. Their Mandarin is right and their Tibetan is right. And the third group might show simplification. And it's actually quite similar to the results that a long time ago we got in my group when we looked at Mandarin heritage speakers who are dominant in English. Their Mandarin was just like Mandarin, but what we were surprised to find was that their English lacked inverse scope. And so now it starts to make more sense. When we first saw that, I was like, what's happening? So this is your trimodal distribution. So what we have in Tibetan, the heritage speakers, multiple grammar of scope. So Tibetan heritage speakers either have baseline grammar with scope ambiguity, or they have simplified grammar with surface scope only. What we don't know, and that's something that could be explored, we don't know if speakers in the baseline show the same variation. We have reasons to believe that that's possible because remember I showed you that when we have a architect, every pirate, English speakers are not all the same. So it might well be that the Tibetan input is also varied. So this is just something that needs to be determined. I want to bring back this idea that in English, only some speakers can have surface scope, and only a subset of speakers are sensitive to scope ambiguity. So that's essentially another way of showing what I already showed. Okay? So now if we look at the Mandarin that these people speak, we also find multiple grammars of scope. In the baseline Mandarin, there's no inverse scope. Here, they have two grammars. So we have baseline grammar without scope ambiguity, and they have scope ambiguity. And the likely reason here could be that they place the subject lower. They don't place it in the topic position. And because of that, they can now have inverse scope. This is something that can be tested. And again, we would need to look at correlated property. But if we have the baseline Mandarin, the subject is high in the topic position. In heritage speakers Mandarin, the subject may be in the specifier of TP, not as high, and as a result, you might get inverse scope. Okay? So again, what we see here is that multiple grammars are possible both in the dominant and in the heritage language. And a lot of things here need to be established empirically, but it looks like there may be principled reasons for the distribution of grammars where they have extra abstract rules and you don't need any extra machinery to model the grammars. And so again, can we predict the distribution of scope options based on proficiency, like I tried to do it with Russian acceptance, age of acquisition, or some other factors? So these are outstanding questions. But if we go back to the chart that I started with, we have an example where we have single grammar in both input languages and multiple grammar in the heritage language. We have single grammar in one language, multiple grammars in the home language, and then we end up with multiple grammars in the bilingual languages, which are interesting cases in and of itself because they show that it's not all about simplification under context, which of course, I'm preaching to the choir here, but a lot of people think when two languages come together, things will always get simpler. No, they don't. So I'm not going to talk about relative clauses because I'm out of time, and I'm happy to talk about them in question period, but let me go to my conclusions. And here I want to make three main points. I want to talk about multiple grammars and diachronic change, multiple grammars in the input, and bilingual strategies of dealing with multiple grammars. So the idea again is that speakers of the same language may rely on more than one analysis of a given surface string. And if that's the case, optionality and variation may only be apparent because they're actually rooted in differences across grammatical mechanisms. These are some of the examples we've already had, and I added some here. I want to go back to this original disclaimer which I made, that not all optionality is due to multiple grammars, and our goal is to distinguish cases of real multiple grammars from optionality and variation. So the question is, can we predict where in the linguistic system multiple grammars can and will occur? And the initial answer, only very preliminary answer, is that we can look for phenomena where grammatical competition has long been noted. So scope is something that we've known to show grammatical competition, and we have a principled explanation for that. We also can look for phenomena that have received competing analysis from linguists. So for example, relative clauses are a famous case where you ask every linguist and they will have their favorite analysis. So, and it might be because relative clauses are subject to multiple grammars. Structure of DPs and NPs, analysis of gender, I just picked some phenomena, but that might be a good place to start. And then finally, something that we actually know about from language change, unstable phenomena under language change, and that's headedness. And that was something that gave Tony Kroc a lot of inspiration, where he looked at, proposed the notion of multiple grammar, where the idea was that when there's multiple grammars in the input, that might contribute to more rapid language change, and we may see diachronic shifts from one grammar to another. According to Kroc and his collaborators, competing grammars often flourish in periods of parametric change, and headedness is one of the main examples. So when you have the head initial and head final settings in early Middle English, there is very strong grammatical competition. You have variation between object, verb, verb, object in Old English, independent of case marking, case ambiguity. So these are all cases where we have multiple grammars and they seem to flourish. Here's an example from Old Church Slavonic, from Pancheva's corpus, where you have the auxiliary before the participle and the participle before the auxiliary. Again, you have headedness variation. So it's a very typical case, and that's where we may expect multiple grammars as well. So when we look at monolinguals, we basically operate on the assumption that they will learn the language by generating principally distinct hypotheses of language when they parse their input. And they might juggle different analyses for a while, and then finally they might arrive at the analysis with the greatest relative fit. But some hypotheses may never be ruled out based on primary data. That means that the seeds of multiple grammars will be living in the input and the intake for a while. And this is where this grammatical competition may actually be unbearable to bilinguals. This is where this whole concept of bilinguals simplifying things can come from, because for them it's just too much. And so they make an executive decision, if you will, to rule things out and get rid of some competing multiple grammars. So I'm going to leave that out and basically stop here and thank you. So also thanking a lot of people who helped me with this work, and the National Science Foundation still exists, so I'm grateful for the funding, although it might be my last. Thank you very much.